Excellent. We are live. Happy Friday, everyone. Welcome to the live show and the Transformational Leader combination, because we record the live show. That way we get video with our guests, more fun. We've got a guest I'm very excited to have on today. I don't like to read bios because I find that ends up being fairly produced. But it also means that I get the opportunity to incorrectly attribute things to my guests, and then they have to correct me. So I'm going to say that we've got someone who is an expert on the area, the sort of maybe the science of belonging, and that's Andrea Carter. So I'm really excited to bring her on in a little bit. Also, in case you are wondering why I've got this cool sort of glam rock look, you can kind of see it there. It's because my friend blasted a pickleball right into my face last Sunday, whilst and I was wearing protective lenses. I'm that nerdy guy who wears protective lenses. And so it left me feeling very smart. I felt very prepared, but just from the frame hitting my eye was like, oh, no worries. We can send a ton of blood to that area. Your eyes are very good at doing that. They're like, oh, we got bumped a little bit. Let's puff it up. So that's why I look a little bit Kiss, like a little glam rocky today. Let's start with a simultaneous sip together. Here we go. Appropriately, what I've got today in my cup is English breakfast tea. Not half bad. Holy, holy, holy. Well, I'd love to hear how everyone's week is going, but this is a podcast, so it doesn't work that way. You just have to sit and listen to us. But if you are out somewhere, if you're listening to this podcast and you're, in line, you're in car, driving somewhere, feel free to just shout out how your week has been, especially if you're in line at the bank or the grocery store. Just say it out loud. It's going to feel great. It's going to feel very cathartic. Maybe it'll start a trend of people shouting out loud how their day or how their week went. My week was, it's felt very full, but not busy. And it's been a week where I've had a number of reschedulings, cancellations, that sort of thing in my calendar, which I used to have this context of kind of scarcity in my practice. And what that meant was when someone canceled, I was like, crap, what's wrong with these people? Why aren't they following through? And how do I convince them or trick them or make them show up in such a way that, all of that sort of stuff. Now I've worked hard to create breakthroughs in this, create more of an experience of living as abundance. And the experience I have, not just the thought, not the intellectual thought, but the experience I have when people have to reschedule is like, sweet, extra time, more spaciousness in my calendar. And I've been devoting that spaciousness to a lot of sort of deep intellectual work, really studying a lot of the different aspects of what I do, my body of work, looking at, how it shows up. So there's a couple brief distinctions that I'm going to share before we get to the main part of our show, where we bring Andrea on. So the first distinction I want to share is what I call an early stage certainty bubble. So an early stage certainty bubble, this is especially alive in leadership contexts, which includes coaching. Coaching, when it's done well, is fundamentally a practice of leadership, and it is fundamentally relational leadership. It is leadership done in very small, sometimes groups, but one-on-one coaching is relational leadership, one-on-one relation. And leadership is ultimately the practice of moving people towards a declared result at its, like, if you want to boil it down at its simplest. You can have read a million different books. You can know all of the stuff in the world about leadership, but if you're not actually moving humans towards some particular kind of result, then you're not really leading. You know about it, but you're not actually embodying it. And so early stage certainty bubble is that place that people arrive at where they're at the early stage of a new insight, of a new practice, of a new thought, or even like a new year's resolution. This is that feeling that you have after an insight, after making a change in your life that feels really profound, what happens at this stage is it feels very salient. Salient meaning like meaningful, meaning sort of like, oh, alive for you. And at this stage, it's very novel. It's new, and we often have an experience internally of like everything's just lining up. Like I finally found the thing. And early stage certainty comes from the fact that all of that salience is there. We're very alive to that thing. And at the same time, the costs or the consequences or the friction points are not yet being felt. They're starting to show up immediately, but all of that salience and that energy that we have that comes from like the novelty and like finally I've made a decision, that's so alive that that's where we get focused. And through the lens of leadership, what early stage certainty means is that there's not a lot of appetite on the side or in the being of the person that is in this bubble. They don't have a lot of appetite for feedback or for inquiry into like what might not work, where might you fall away, how might this not support, not support, how might this not kind of unfold the way you think it will go, how might you quit, how might this be crappy. And so that's a point where if we're leading someone, we have to have some space for this. We have to allow them space to kind of chug along at this point because they're not interested in anything different. And what I notice a lot of leaders do, in particular, a lot of coaches do, is try to force in, like to kind of try to check that honeymoon, to really like, let me, but you need to understand, or blah, 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 blah. And what that does is it's experienced kind of like someone trying to impose, or what often happens is that the person in the bubble has this experience like this person just doesn't get it. They don't understand. Now, of course, actually that person probably can see a little bit further out of the horizon because you're in this early stage certainty bubble, but it doesn't matter because the experience on receiving that feedback is they don't get it. And if the experience we as a leader are creating in someone when we offer them feedback is that we delivering the feedback don't get it, then our feedback's not going to land. And if our feedback's not going to land, it doesn't matter how rich, how wise, how good it is. It's for naught. And so this is the part where as leaders, we have to start to learn not just how do we speak in a particular way that lands, but also what is the listening over there that we are speaking into? Is this person currently a listening that would allow our feedback to arrive? Or is there a different way we need to speak so that whatever the way they're listening is going to actually be able to like connect with what we're providing them? So early stage certainty. You see this a lot. It's really an interesting thing. It's quite ironic because people will do things like, be a founder, leave their job, start a startup, found something. This is the place when coaching can be like the most rich. But of course, because they've done something new, because they're alive with the possibility of that, they're actually closed to that. So even though there'd be like a perfect place for that to connect, for that leadership to take root, it actually, the soil isn't fertile yet. So if you're someone that encounters this, the work is to stay connected with that person, to really honor the place they are. You don't want to label it as, oh, you're in early stage certainty bubble. That feels obnoxious and rude and arrogant. You just want to know that that's alive for yourself and recognize that what happens is as someone is in this, as time goes on, they're going to start to have it checked by reality. Because the truth is, there is never a state we get into where everything just clicks perfectly from now till the end of time. As much as we'd like to believe that, the truth is that any journey is bumpy and the road is winding, and there's going to be moments of empowerment, there's going to be moments of disempowerment. So our job is to honor where the person is, be able to see the place that they are in, be able to catch it, hold it, by which I mean not make it wrong, just understand it and get it and hold it. Preserve their dignity in it, by which I mean not telling them, you fool, you stupid idiot, how can you not see you're in the honeymoon phase? And instead just honor that and really celebrate it and have our arms wide enough that they have all the room in the world to explore this, but that there's someone there that can they can find their way back to us, or that we can stay in relationship to support them when that starts to shift. That happens with time. So that distinction, early stage certainty bubble, that's one of the things that's been alive for me this week. The other thing that's been alive for me has been this idea of crossing a threshold in any kind of transformational work. And what happens, I notice, is that most of us, the sort of people that find their way into my work, that find their way into like our events, the intensive, the retreat, the forge, stuff like that, those people are at a threshold. And the threshold is where they are starting to see that the way, they don't have this fully consciously distinguished, but what they're seeing on some levels, that the way they've done things historically to get to this point is starting to generate diminishing returns. It's providing less and less and less. And further, that there's something that they are called to, something they either really want, something that their job is asking of them, something that their mission or their purpose is demanding that they create in the world, so on and so forth. There is something that is calling them to create, like the saying, you got to create something new. There's something here you want to create, and the old way is not going to be enough. And that creates a threshold that they have to cross. There's a couple things I want to say about this threshold. But first, I want to go off mic and burp. So I've done that. Now I'm going to say the things about the threshold. Those are my 2 bullet points. I've done number 1. Tell them what you're going to do it, tell them you did it. Nailing it. Excellent PowerPoint presentation here. So the first thing is that not everyone, plenty of people become aware of this experience of being at the threshold, but many, many people don't have something that's actually calling them forward. So they're like, I can tell that I feel lethargic and bored, or I can tell that I don't get enough juice out of what I'm doing anymore, or I'm alive to the fact that like I have an approach and it does this, but I'm kind of bored. But there's nothing on the other side that's actually strong enough for them to choose into it. And that's important because crossing the threshold will cost you something. It'll cost you probably something financially. Working in a container that can support you to get out of this, that's going to cost you something financially, but more importantly, it's going to cost you something energetically. You're going to have to give up something. You're going to have to let go of something. And most importantly, you're going to have to bring yourself into contact with something that probably won't feel that nice, that you've probably spent your life avoiding, or even arranged all of the way you show up in life so as to avoid having to come into contact with. And absent a reason, a call forward, a purpose, a task at work, a project, absent something that you are being asked to create by the universe, life, spirit, God, whatever, this experience on this side of the threshold is not sufficient to get you over. So the experience leading up to the threshold is enough to have you start to become aware of it, but is not sufficient to have you cross it. The second thing that happens is that some people hope, many people, many of us, especially those of us that are very brilliant, we hope that enough analysis and intellectual understanding of the threshold and what is happening will be sufficient to get us across it. So sort of like, if I just stay in one more conversation, or if I just orbit this person who seems to have it figured out, if I just learn enough, then that threshold will get crossed. And this is sort of like, on some level, there's a lot of ways this can happen. One is just studying, reading books, learning, being in conversations, being in ways that allow you to stay near the work, but never actually let the work fully touch you. That's a really popular one. So sort of being in like, a check-in every 6 months with a coach where you just share what's up and share what's going on, but never really dive in with them, as an example. Another version of this would be, hold on, let me have a sip of tea and remember it. I can't remember what it was. I forgot what it was. It'll come back at some point. But either way, what happens is we hang out here hoping that if we do this enough, or if we wait long enough, somehow that threshold is going to become different. And the truth is, it won't. The threshold is the way you cross the threshold is the moment you step into being this new way of being that is asked of you, before it's fully formed, before you have before you fully understand how it's going to unfold, before you're ready, before is the way you could kind of summarize this. And that is very scary, because doing that means that this process is going to change you. And all of the analysis and trying to figure out, what that's ultimately doing is it's trying to set us up so that we can understand enough and then on some level unconsciously avoid being truly changed by that thing. And so not everyone crosses this threshold. In fact, many people don't. Many people stay right up beside it, which is, a legitimate path. If we stay right up beside it, we can learn about this sort of stuff. We can become very, very proficient in explaining and describing it. We can actually become very expert at teaching about it, but we never actually become the thing on the other side. What I've just described is like, do I want to be really pointed here? Or like, I'm going to be really pointed here. What I've just described is an indictment of the coaching and leadership professions. It is people that are right up against that threshold and can describe it beautifully. They can articulate it, they can talk about it, they can tell you all about it, but they have not made that step. And the more we spend time in the intellectual understanding of it, the more we end up getting entrenched right there. The more this becomes the whole identity that we have, and that makes it even harder as time goes on to step across that threshold. Last thing I want to say about this today. The good news is that if we stay at that threshold without crossing it, the thing calling us forward, I should take a step back. So we've said there's some people for which there's not a thing calling us forward. There's just the experience of the diminishing returns. That's okay. There's nothing wrong with that. You're not supposed to cross this in the sense of you should do something or you should not. The second thing is some people get to this point, they're aware and alive that, hey, something needs to shift and I can't do it on my own steam because my own steam is the old pattern. And I can feel the call towards something else. There's something demanding more of me. And sometimes what people do at that point is they resist. They resist crossing because crossing exposes them. At this stage, we call this kind of point where you cross this threshold embodied exposure. So you're actually choosing into a new way of being, and that will transform you, and it will upturn things for you. It's going to disrupt the safety of what you already know. A lot of people don't want to do that, understandably. And if we don't do that, what happens is that this voice on this side of the threshold that is saying like, hey, there's a call forward, there's something here, that will start to harden and dull. The voice becomes quieter, and we become sort of like, if I just keep poking at you, eventually your skin is going to start to callous, and you're going to feel that poke a little bit less and a little bit less and a little bit less until eventually you can't feel it. And so that's what happens over time. Down this particular path, we get to stay adjacent to transformation. We get to understand it. We get to intellectually really have a lot to say about it, but we don't cross it. And over time, the crossing becomes harder because we get better and better and better at making money, becoming seen as an expert in this area. And we get less and less able to hear the voice on the other side of this. So that's kind of the nature of the two paths that show up down this kind of line of work. Is one side is staying close to the threshold, staying adjacent to it. And then the other one is taking the risk of exposing ourselves, putting ourselves in it. Last thing I'm going to say here before we bring on Andrea is I was thinking today about like what are some examples? What are some places where I've like bumbled across the threshold in my own life? And like the one that was just coming to mind as I was coming onto this podcast was I can remember there was a point where I was afraid to offer any reflection period to anyone at all. Like, hey, I noticed that you're saying this, but you're being this, reflection, disruption. And I was practicing crossing that threshold. And I recognized like, I don't yet know how to do this artfully. I'm going to have to, in order to do this, I'm going to have to start being the person that does it. And then I will have to learn the art. That's as much as I knew. It was all scary. And I had this one person where I had been signed up to guest on their podcast, and they had a form that was all very sort of businesslike. That's their prerogative. And at the bottom of the form, they said, is there anything you'd want from me as a guest? And so I wrote, I would like to feel more of your heart. That was my kind of like clumsy attempt. And we got onto the podcast, and like we had a half hour before we started, and she was not impressed with me, and she let me know that I was a dick. And I mean, I'm laughing now. It was not funny for me at the moment. I felt really, really bad and clumsy and stupid and a little defensive and a little bit righteous too. But it was really funny because I was backpedaling like, oh my God, I'm so sorry. And then And then she said with like 5 minutes left, okay, like we gotta get ready to go live here. And I was like, we cannot do a podcast like this. Like I at least had the wherewithal to know like we can't, not with this. I've created a huge friggin' mess. And so that podcast didn't happen. And I was still thinking about it today, just like, ooh, pulling at my collar, feeling mighty sheepish. So that's what it is to cross the threshold, is to expose ourselves, to put ourselves in the situations we would otherwise probably have designed our lives up to this point to avoid. Be with them. Okay, let's have a sip. I'm going to briefly introduce our guest and then we'll get her in here. So, I love what Doug wrote here. Hey, Doug, nice to see you, man. Doug, who just released an exciting game on Kickstarter, which I have proudly kickstarted and pledged, and I'm excited to play, an escape room comic book style board game. So if you are even a modicum as nerdy as I am, go check out Doug's game. I think it's called, Doug, maybe you can put it in a comment, but I think it's called Escape Comics. I'm super excited to see it. It looks really beautiful. It's been eight years, I think he told me, in the making. So anyhow, Doug writes, this is true in very practical terms as well. Many people who teach topics like marketing at university, many professors don't have experience in the practice of marketing. They are experts at theory, but don't live in the marketing funnel. Well said, Doug. It might be cool actually to have Doug on because he's just gone through this in an embodied sense. Kickstarting that game has meant he's been in the flow of that. So anyhow, okay. Briefly, I want to share about Andrea and then I'll bring her on. One of the things I really appreciate and I'm excited about here is that every time someone comes and asks to be a guest, I send them back questions. I first let them know, like, look, this is not a place where we're going to explore your expertise. It's a place where we're going to certainly look at what you're up to, but also look for opportunities where something might be overly polished or there might be a moment to slow down or something like that. And I ask questions like, what part of yourself do you tend to rely on under pressure, even when it costs you something? Or when things are going well, what do you stop questioning about yourself? And what these questions are doing is they're pressure testing the guest's ability to slow down and actually take a look below the polished answer of their framework and see like how able are they to actually take a look. And that's not easy. That's not easy at all. And Andrea sent me some answers and they were pretty good. And I wrote back and said, like, can you please try to look harder, look deeper into this? And she sent me answers on Wednesday and I was like, man, these are amazing. This is incredible. Like really took a look, really dove in. So I'm really excited to bring Andrea on. So Andrea, can you put on your video, turn on your mic, get those glasses looking super sharp. Look at these frames, everyone. Oh, she's showing me up. Hello, happy Friday.
Hello, happy Friday. Thanks for having me on, Adam. And my goodness, like what a place for us to start out on a Friday. Early stage certainty, crossing the threshold, embodied exposure. You're just like, laying the foundation for us to have a really great podcast. So thank you.
I didn't even think I was doing that. I'm excited.
Well, you were kind of talking about belonging in a very, I would say, theory practiced perspective. And I love that what you have created here on your podcast, and even just in our correspondence, is that need to go deeper and that need to look at crossing that threshold. And so I really thank you for that opportunity. And I'm excited for today. I don't know how this is going to go. I'm going to let you lead me and I'm going to just be as human as possible. How
Sweet.
about that?
Yeah, it sounds fantastic. Well, let's start here. So belonging, your realm of expertise, fair?
Fair.
Okay, great. So as a starting point, belonging would be the B in DEIB, right? Diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging. Do I have that much right?
I would argue that. I would say that most people understand IDEA. So IDEA is inclusion, diversity, equity, accessibility, which is our Canadian element of looking at DEI, which would be the partner to the US and abroad. Belonging is actually completely separate. We measure completely different things. the way that we actually access it, what it requires, how you measure it within an organization, and then also how you actually use it from a relational perspective.
Yeah.
Those elements are very different than what would be clumped into idea and the organizational lens of that.
Interesting. But I
But
imagine a lot of people would just mash those, like conflate them for sake
totally.
of,
And
yeah, go ahead, please.
yeah, and what we're seeing today, what I find so fascinating is the rebranding of idea into the word belonging, which is such a problematic
Mm.
element that we are seeing. One of my close colleagues was actually just at a rewards dinner the other night, and she said, "Oh my goodness, Andrea, everybody's talking about belonging and how they're creating belonging organizations." And she's like, and then I listen to them talk and they have no idea what they're talking about. And it just made me laugh, because I think that there are a lot of people that understand the feeling of belonging, but don't understand that belonging is the science you can feel, but more so, it's actually how you perform. And that, I think, is the important piece behind the science of it.
Can you say more about that, but to a layperson like me? Like, what is, so the science of how you feel, I think is what I heard you say. And then also how you perform. Did I hear that right?
You got it.
So what are those two, like succinctly, what do those mean to someone not educated in this work?
Yeah. So, well, there's kind of two portions to this. So the first I would say is that we have to identify the difference between belonging and fitting in. So most of us have experienced the world where we have been invited into fitting in spaces. So you can be included, you can be invited in. But
can you give me like a simple example?
Yeah. So if 100% of the environment for you to conform relies on you being able to meet somebody else's expectations, somebody else's needs, it means that you are not co-creating, you are not interdependent, and you will never measure up. In those scenarios.
Would this be like me going to, I'm trying to construct like just a simple felt example. So would this be like me traveling to Tokyo and sort of like trying to conform to their norms and cultures and stuff? Would it be me being invited to a workplace? Like can you make it real?
So let me use it from my perspective. So I'm 6 feet tall. My sisters are 5'2" and 5'4".
Wow, that's quite a spread.
Okay. My parents are 5'7" and under, 5'7", 5'6".
You ate all the food growing up.
Well, what's fascinating is that it wasn't necessarily about that. It was that there was no version of blending in available to me. Okay. So I learned something very early, that I could feel the difference in environments where I was tolerated and environments where I actually belonged. And fitting in looks like belonging from the outside, but it's performative, it's transactional. It's completely different from a neurological perspective and experience from belonging. And when you grow up without something, and I think the thing about this experience is that everybody has likely had an experience where they were the tall person, or they were the short person, or they were, put one identity to something and they were all of a sudden different. Okay.
So let me ask you a question. Oh, go ahead, please.
Yeah. Well, what I was going to say is, in those moments, depending on how people show up for you, you're either going to have somebody meet you and actually bring you into the environment, and you're going to meet them. So it's like a 50-50, your accountability, your responsibility, and you're co-creating the environment together so that somebody can be different, but they are 100% still in that concept of belonging. That is very different, right? So my sisters used to tease me, for example. They would say, I'm never going to find a man tall enough to marry. And I would always say to them, well, I'm going to find a giant and I'm going to marry him and I'm going to have my own giant family where tall people actually belong. And I did just that. I literally married, my husband's 6'10". My eldest son, who's 18, he is now 6'8". My daughter, who's 15, is 6'1". I
Right.
built the belonging that I did not have.
Mm.
Okay. But
So fitting in would be
yeah,
where I show up and I do what is required. It's sort of like on my shoulders to appear as if, or to be in such a way that has me arrange myself to kind of meet what the group looks like or how the group shows up or whatever. Is that more or less on the right page?
yeah, you're conforming, if you will.
Right. And then
Mhm.
belonging would be more sort of where the group, and then there's, you're saying co-creation, but like the group is more adapting itself or finding ways to bring me in without requiring that fitting in. Is that also accurate?
Yes.
Okay, got it. Okay. Okay, what more? Please continue. Go
Yeah.
ahead.
Oh, great. So if you think about belonging as the science that you can feel, everybody knows when they feel belonging in an environment.
Hmm.
We measured that. And so what happened was actually that early in 2018, we were looking at DEI, or idea principles, and we looked at the concept of whether or not it would polarize or bring people together. And the way that it was being taught, the way that it was being introduced, actually created more division, more polarization than it did actually bringing people together. And
Hmm.
so it forced me to actually look at a different way of exploring um, what we were asking. And so I essentially looked at the question of what is it that the brain actually needs in order to experience belonging in any environment.
Hmm.
And that led me to a very different form of study. I looked at it through the lens of the neuroscience. And what happened was when we measured it, we actually did this study within the mining industry,
Mm-hmm.
which was fascinating in of itself. So there was just over 3,500 participants, and 13 companies participated. And what was fascinating was that the initial words that we had used were actually too um, divisive. And so what
What were those
came
words?
so, if we go back, it was a lot of the inclusion, and it
Hmm.
was diversity, and it was words around psychological safety, and
Right.
so a lot of these elements that really people, again, I would go back to so many people being in that early stage of certainty of what this is, but
Yes.
not actually being able to cross the threshold because the experience wasn't there in a way that was meaningful to many
Yes.
people. And so, what was fascinating was that originally the study was meant to just validate a survey to be able to look at how you measure belonging in a large environment. But it took me then because the results were so interesting. So there's 5 indicators of
Hmm.
belonging. They were not my language, this is the language of the participants. So the 5 indicators are comfort, connection, contribution, psychological safety, and well-being. I still question whether psychological safety is the right wording there. Might just be safety. Um,
So these are the criteria, qualitative, I think, right? Like
Qualitative. Yep.
subjective, that is
Yep.
required for me to feel, to have a felt experience of belonging. When those 5 things are present to some extent, then I am in the experience of belonging. Is that right?
Yes. Yes.
Gotcha.
Exactly. And so what's fascinating is that people often go, "Well, Andrea, like comfort, like what does that mean that we all have to be comfortable and nice with each other?" And it's actually not that. So comfort, when you break it down, is actually your brain's ability to be in a situation of friction or conflict, but have enough clarity and predictability that you can see it and not opt out of it. And so your brain recognizes, hey, I see this. I have an awareness that this is challenging or hard, but I have enough context. I know how I can succeed. I know what it is that people want from me. I have enough clarity about where we're going together. There's enough predictability for me to go, actually, my brain's not going to be in fight flight mode. Um, I'm not going to be, stuck in this element of the amygdala being in fight flight. And I can actually ease into this friction. So when your brain doesn't experience belonging, it's actually metabolically more challenging for somebody who just fits in. And they've
Sure, that
measured
makes
that.
sense.
That's not my research. That's James Cohen's research. But
I can even understand that just like from a like anecdotally, just
totally.
the experience of me. There's even if I just sort of break it into really, really broad layman's terms, if I'm trying to do something on top of a performance of whatever sort, performing how I need to be to fit in, my brain's divided on two fronts. I'm going to be less effective. I'm going to have less resources to devote to whatever. So yeah, that makes total sense.
Totally. And your brain can actually do both. You can't be in protection mode and be in innovation or problem solving or creativity mode. Your brain actually can't do both at the same time. So your effectiveness of actually being within a space where you are constantly having to fit in is actually where the performance element comes in. So in performance or in organizations, if we look at what we're measuring, a lot of organizations are actually measuring the wrong thing because they're not actually looking at the fact that belonging actually amplifies somebody's ability to perform at their best. And it
Right.
starts with comfort, right?
Okay, I've got some questions here, but yes, you
Yeah,
can.
totally.
It sounded like you were about to ask me if you could do something.
But yes, you can. I was going to ask you if I can go into the next indicator, but I'm going to let you ask me a question and I'm going to
Well,
take a
I mean,
sip.
we could explore each of those indicators, but I think this makes
Mhm.
sense enough for us to kind of delve into it because I have questions less specific to the science of it.
Okay.
Like I'm kind of curious. First of all, when I listen to this, it sounds very, and I know this isn't necessarily how it exists in practice, but very engineered. I'm like, okay, got it. 5 factors, and you look at each of these factors, and there's probably confounding variables, and all of that stuff. And I imagine there's quite a science behind it. How do you find people meet this in practice?
Yeah. So after we measured everything, validated everything, we started looking at the language and how people relate to it. And I would say that this is it actually goes back to the question that you asked me in our email exchange. And so, when I looked at what you said, I'm going to go back to what you said first. What you said was you're most effective and least alive in the same place.
Mm-hmm.
Something to that.
That's right.
Am
Yeah,
I paraphrasing it? Okay.
you nailed it.
And so, okay. And so being the person who's figured out belonging, where are you not going? I don't know that that's how you said it, but we'll run with that. So we're looking at this space of, okay, the methodology is validated. So from my 3,500, we've now worked with 150,000 employees plus 8 industries.
Yeah.
I can walk into organizations, boardrooms, communities, schools, government, diagnose, okay, these are the places that belonging is the most broken.
Yeah.
Okay. I can stand on a stage. I can name where organizations are investing and actually what predicts performance. But here's where I'm the most protected. And it's fascinating because I would say that most people are similar.
Mm.
So protection is not the same thing as presence, right? Expertise lets me stand in this like resolved version of the story of belonging. But if we look at where it's unresolved, which I feel that we actually have to continue to do, that's actually where most people fall in the gap between fitting in and belonging.
Mm-hmm.
And so what happens is that, if I'm navigating belonging through my family and through my most challenging family members, where belonging does not exist, right? Because people are socialized to replicate fitting in environments where
Well, I have a
relationships
question
are,
to interject here. Is that all right?
yeah,
I could imagine there's the belonging that occurs by default. So just around my friends, it's not like we've sat down and been like, okay, we got 5 qualitative things, and like I think we're doing pretty good over here on these 4, but Colin, you got
yeah,
this just there. And then
yeah,
there's challenging family members that stereotype would probably be Thanksgiving dinner with your extended family. How could they vote for that political party or this political party or whatever? So there's that, and then there's a constructed or a place where belonging is like intentionally created, which I think is kind of the work you're bringing to companies and so on and so forth. Okay.
yeah.
So, in the instance of your family, I guess I'm curious, like, is there actually anything to do as far as belonging is concerned? Like, how does that interact? Because it occurs like, and correct me if I'm wrong, but your work is more about finding the places where there's a clear case for creating something that isn't there by default.
So, sorry, there was a bit of a delay there, but I,
Yep.
I think what I will say here is that yes, we're creating it within the organization, but I think what you need to understand is that employees experience organizations as relationships.
Mm-hmm.
Organizations experience employees as transactional.
Mm-hmm.
That's where the gap exists. So great, this work can be pulled in really easily, but your relationships are actually where belonging exists. Transactional relationships are fitting in. Power runs on money and hierarchy. Person with the most money holds the most power. Everyone else has to work around them, their schedules, their considerations, their needs. No one else is considered. We can also look at that through the familial lines, through systemic socialized conditions. So sometimes it can be about money, or for other people, sometimes it's about the eldest person who holds the most anchoring into how the family evolved, what the family values should be based on its origin, rather than what the behaviors that are now in effect are acceptable, right? And so looking at origins of generations that came before them. So if I look at how I broke the cycle in my own household, and what I mean by that is my children, my husband, that's a belonging relationship. But that extension of my family operates still with those old patterns, with specific family. And so what I recognized really early was that we didn't have language, and we didn't have ways of actually looking at, am I giving you belonging or am I not giving you belonging? Are you giving me belonging or are you not giving me belonging? So early into the diagnostic element, we also had to look at how leaders, and that can be people leaders, that can also just be an individual contributor, how they are actually creating relationships. And what a lot of the research shows is that we don't have language for it. We can't put our finger on a lot of it. And so this feeling of belonging is actually something that's super esoteric, and why it can't be replicated. And I think what my research does is it actually breaks it down and says, well, actually, if we look at this, we can see where I am least present, where I still continue to dim in this moment, inside this place of these specific people, where it's still broken for me.
So
And
where, may I ask, like, where would that be in your familial relations?
yeah, so there's, I won't name the people because I
Please not.
don't
Yes.
believe in that. But there's an accountability model, that 50-50 accountability model that I talked about with belonging, where belonging is shared responsibility, where it is co-created, where it is independent, and where you're bringing your presence, your empathy, your trust, your self-regulation, right?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Performing at your best for those people. And so when I look at that and the instrument that I use, it allows me to look at what's the score of that? How much am I giving and how much are they giving? And then also looking at where is that from those 5 indicators? And so when I look at that assessment and I kind of break down those elements, there's a couple of people in my family where it's so broken that I would say we're in complete reset mode. And there's kind of 4, not kind of, there are 4 paths that we've also identified within the actual science of it: restore, repair, rebuild, and reset. And restore is, you have belonging, it's strong, but there are places where you need to have a conversation so that you can actually build or tweak before stress or friction is going to test them. Repair is where you're actually looking at having a conversation because there's likely 1 or 2 specific issues that continuously create friction. And so one conversation, one ask, one clear correction, and you're actually using the repair to actively repair the relationship. Rebuild, you're stuck in a loop. This is where it's like continuous, right? And the goal is to actually rebuild how you're moving through that friction together, not just revisiting the same conflict over and over again. And then reset is belonging's broken. Okay. This isn't just about your relationship. It's actually going back to you, and it's starting with you. And it means that you have to clarify your own standards, your own boundaries, your own needs, your own self-trust, your own self-regulation first, before you can even go back to entertaining that element of rebuilding, right? And working your way back through it. So for me, I have kind of a couple of different places. With one person, we're in complete reset. While I was going through all of this work, I really needed to step away from the relationship. And one of the things that I see today that's so dangerous in our society, in our organizations, in our communities, is that we have gotten into the experience that cancel culture is actually more lucrative, if you will, than understanding how to make your way back into rebuilding. And so this is where we have all of these fractions within, our relationships. And what I feel, based on not just the data, but then also where we are, is that I think that when it comes to creating a new baseline, cutting people out is actually returning to fitting in a very socialized way, where it's ostracization, right? It is, I am literally not going to listen to you or try and understand you anymore because you've crossed my boundaries or you've done XYZ. And I do believe that at times in your life, you do need a complete reset with certain individuals. I actually feel that's incredibly healthy. Where it remains unhealthy is when you don't do the work to keep going back, and what that language looks like. And so if I reflect on my own family and I reflect on where the language is important, it's that, while I was building this, I recognized the gaps in my own personal experience, and go challenges being the expert, because I'm able to provide belonging structure to change the feeling and the experience within an organization. So then how am I not giving belonging to others within my own family? And I'm falling into the same patterns of fitting in, where that's actually what I'm fighting hard against, right? So my judgment, if you will, of their inability to want to get to know my kids as incredible humans, how they're known on their sports teams, at their schools, with their teachers, with their communities, allows me to shame them. I become righteous. I become the person who says, you're ignorant for choosing to shame them without understanding them first.
Right. You're not creating belonging.
Yeah. So in essence, I'm not giving belonging. I'm reinforcing fitting in.
So thank you for sharing that. And I think that my experience across the board really is that um, part of the way our systems, our internal systems, you can call it your ego, your structure, whatever, it doesn't really matter, work
Mhm.
is that they create guidelines, almost dogma, love your neighbor, except that guy, because that guy doesn't love his neighbor, he's a dickhead. But I love my neighbor, right? And then it becomes very surreptitious and
Mhm.
justified,
Mhm.
and yet it has us stuck. We can't seem to grow beyond it for all those reasons. So I could imagine righteousness would be one of the things that would be bred that would get in people's way, where they would sort of like, it allows people to point the finger and be like, well, they're not
Mhm.
doing their 50%. Therefore, what else do you find? Like, I'm kind of interested beyond the science and more just like if you can speak more from just a felt experience or like a just, what you see, what else do you see people struggle with in this sort of stuff? How is it challenging for people to create or to live into or cross that threshold?
Yeah, so, a lot of it is the placing of the blame or the placing of the shame on the other person,
Uh-huh.
without understanding where they are, um, also part of
Mm-hmm.
the solution. And so if I look at a lot of the broken relationships, and this is across the board, I would say, whether this
Mm-hmm.
is working with leaders or working with friends and family, this is working with neighbors. you know, what I see consistently is that there is the inability to understand what it means to listen to another human being and try and actually understand where they are coming from
Mm-hmm.
without being ready to react or to just respond. And so when we
That
look at the
demands something of people. That
yes,
creates a lot of tension internally to do that.
yes. And
Mm-hmm.
so that ability to sit with that tension and not go into the anger or the reaction or the pushing back, that's actually where we become so dysregulated. And
Yes.
I'll give you an example for myself because I think it's easiest when I use relational elements.
Sure.
So imagine we're sitting at a kitchen table. My kids are there, family members are there, and a particular person says, "Well, in our family, we enunciate." And something so silly. Okay, great, you enunciate. But in our family distinguishes between our family and your family. And so that judgment of who's enunciating and who is not. And when you look at in our family, we do it this way and we're better. In your family, you do it that way and you're not. That divisive element is something that most people will not um, allow space to reflect on what that means and why that person is saying it. And in that moment, it's funny. When I grew up in a very dysfunctional family,
Mm-hmm.
I there was a lot of abuse. There was a lot of places that kids should have been protected that weren't. And so now I have two children. And so I consistently have to fight against this mama bear kind of composure where I wasn't protected. And so I need to make sure my family is protected, my children are protected. And what's fascinating with that is that something as simple as, well, our family does this and you're not part of our family because you do it this way, says a lot about the fact that are you actually open to listening to what they actually have to say? Are you listening to what they actually are trying to say? Or are you just wanting them to behave or perform in a certain way?
I
And
have a
I think
question
that,
about that.
yeah, go for it.
So I get in that example, we could hold it like there's a distinction here that's being made real between belonging and fitting in. And
Sure.
that statement is a statement that says in this space you fit in or you don't. That's the alternative, right? You're like, well, in my
Yeah.
family we don't. We talk like this or whatever. And but there's a line drawn, there's a distinction. And I could imagine part of the risk of your work is that belonging is elevated and exalted such that it is better or becomes a this is how we should be. And is that intended? Is that how you hold it? Or like how do you put these two things against each other?
Well, I think the piece that I always look at is that we expect the environment to give us belonging, but
Mm-hmm.
we don't necessarily show up to give them belonging. And so, in that moment, shutting down the conversation is often what will end up happening, right?
Mm-hmm.
You're not providing belonging, so I'm going to shut this down.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that that is the human nature. That is the element of not wanting to sit in the tension. And so sitting in the tension, I think the next piece is, well, what does that actually mean? What does it mean to enunciate? What is it that you are
But we're
trying
getting a
to
bit
get
far from what I'm
across?
asking you, which is there's a distinction between these two things. Are you holding that creating a space of belonging is what we ought to move towards? Or are you kind of holding like these are two distinct spaces that are kind of, you know, what they do is they make certain things available and other things unavailable, but, you know, distinguish the space, be clear on it, and then move forward from there. Like which of those two are you kind of advocating for or kind of leaning towards?
Yeah. So, I fundamentally feel that from a family perspective, we want to create a belonging environment.
I
Um,
see.
I do feel that having conversations where you're actually using language that allows people to be who they are and not shut down is something that is incredibly important, especially if you look at how traumatized our youth are right now. For the first time ever in society, our youth is the most unhappy they've ever been. So when we look at cancel culture, when we look at social media, when we look at AI, that propensity to shut other people down and cut them out also shows us where the fitting in culture is actually creating ostracization, exclusion, stigmatization that fractions families, that fractions communities. And so we have the highest levels of estrangement and loneliness ever recorded in history. We have the lowest levels of trust and empathy ever recorded in history. We have the highest levels of cancel culture and misinformation ever recorded in history. And so, if I look at that from a familial place, what are we missing? Absolutely, we're missing belonging. And
Mm.
absolutely, are we missing language and framework so we can actually help people stay out of threat and in performance? And I think, from a fundamental perspective, um, when I look at what I want to see in family, yeah, there's going to be conflict, there's going to be friction. But most families don't know what to do with conflict or friction. And so it's swept under the rug or it's you're out. The same thing is true in organizations. It just looks different. And so I fundamentally feel that we have to have ways to bring families back together and to bring kids into a place where they cannot necessarily have to be in threat mode around extended family.
Well, let me posit something and see,
Yeah.
like, gather your thoughts on it. So,
Yeah.
what I'm hearing is that whilst there are two choices, we could argue in this distinction that's being drawn, they're not equal choices. One is better or more important right now, or, you know, all of that. And that would be belonging as opposed to fitting in. And my experience in the abstract is that what that creates is a tilted floor in terms of like people actually being able to choose. And when people feel pushed into a choice, it diminishes the agency in their actual choice and makes it harder for them to do so. I'm going to give you an example, okay? So if something happens and I tell someone apologize to that person for what you did, they might do the doing of apologizing, but the underlying felt experience is often not so apologetic because they haven't been able to arrive at that point themselves. They haven't been able to, confront the consequences of not all of that sort of stuff. So I'm curious, I could imagine that there's some people for which they feel I should move over here, but in that should, they bypass the part of themselves that is still getting something from fitting in, and they're kind of trying to mute that voice and just force themselves over here. Do you ever see that show up in your work, where there's sort of like a snag or something where people don't want to give something up, but they're not able to voice it?
I do. And I think that that also comes back to the language that we're using. So when people don't actually have questions that allow them to be in a space where they can ask themselves and confront those barriers, I think it's very easy to stay in that challenge. And I think that's the piece that was so important for me, to look at where the indicators of belonging actually give us language and give us questions and give us pieces to actually ask, so that you actually can fundamentally look at, okay, so I'm in threat mode right now. Why am I in threat mode? Why is it that I'm in this space where somebody has asked me to apologize and I'm like, piss off. I'm in the right, you're in the wrong. Why would I do that? But okay, I'll go apologize if that's what you want.
Yeah.
That is, in essence, that is what fitting in does, right? It forces the person with the most hierarchy or power to force somebody else to behave in a certain way. Um, when I look at the language of belonging, and when I look at how we actually have to question what we're showing up with versus what somebody else is showing up with, um, I think that's actually what allows us to be a little bit more predictable and emotionally regulated. If you ask somebody, do you recognize where you're actually coming into this dysregulated? Most people would say no, right? Most people would be completely blind to the fact that how they walk into a room is either going to regulate or dysregulate the rest of that room. And so, having specific questions that people can actually look at and then go back to, um, has foundationally changed how we actually can show up. And your brain recognizes the people around you who want to know and understand you. That's what mirror neurons are for. That's what actually demonstrates to us, before we can even put words into action, that there is mutual trust, that there is responsibility, that there's accountability, that there's trust beyond transaction. And I think that when you look at relationships that are transactional, that's where there is a value of another human being's perspective, what they bring to the table, what you can provide, how they're considered. When connection is absent, um, to know and be known doesn't exist. Those mirror neurons are not going to fire in that environment. And in that environment, that's an incredibly risky and unsafe space to be in.
Well, let's say cultural rite of passage. So, like tribal, where you have to go through some scarring or something like that. Culture
Mhm.
of fitting in or belonging.
That's not, so I would say that that is still culture of belonging.
Okay.
Your ability to mess up and make mistakes 100% has got to be part of your process. Um, the inability to use language today and try and understand someone is actually one of the places that we see this the most. So people have just stopped talking because they are so scared that if they say the wrong thing, they will be judged, shamed,
Can you
ostracized.
ground this in the example I provided? Because I noticed we're getting a little back into the abstract, and it'd be helpful for me just to help me understand the example if you could speak into that.
So, where's a space in your time that you massively screwed up in rite of passage? Let's go there.
Well, to be honest, I would say that most of my approaches that I learned were to avoid that risk. So you could say I almost screwed up in rite of passage by like not allowing myself to cross that threshold. Now I can go past that and try to find like an example if you'd like, but that feels important for me to highlight.
So yeah, so your need to be perfect
Mm-hmm.
and to show up perfectly was actually part of the fitting in process that you were
Yes.
in.
Yeah.
Your inability to test the waters and to learn from that was likely presented to you in that way so that it was never safe for you to challenge or explore what growth could look like.
Mm-hmm.
And so when we're living from that perspective, we are constantly only living for somebody else's view on what is right or wrong. Um, you know, getting a speeding ticket, drinking for your first time, um, going to a dance and asking somebody to dance. Rites of passage.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So when we're in those rites of passage and we do that wrong, what happens?
What is doing it wrong?
Well, that's the question. So doing it wrong depends on the culture, doesn't it?
Right.
So in your perfect world, I'm gonna use that as a metaphor,
Sure. Yeah. Yeah.
if you will. In your perfect world, what would that have been? So if you had gotten a speeding ticket, what would have happened?
I get pulled over and the police officer says you're a very polite young man and does not write me a ticket.
Okay. In your perfect world, what does it look like asking somebody to dance?
I ask them to dance and they say I would love to.
Okay. In your perfect world, what does it look like when what was the other example that we had?
I think you said get caught drinking.
Oh, you get caught drinking. Yeah.
Get caught drinking and my parents are like, we're disappointed, but we love you and please don't do that and whatever.
So in those examples, those are all incredibly safe examples. What does that then cause you to not explore and not do in your own life?
That's a very broad question. Can you narrow that for me a little bit?
So, how do you behave so that you are constantly doing what your parents want you to do?
Well, there's a bunch of stuff that I could align with. Like I would figure out what the rules are, figure out how to
Mhm.
operate within them, figure out what the rules are, and for anything that I want to make sure I'm allowed to do, even though it's outside of the rules, find ways to do it that are outside of those rules, and so on and so forth.
And so, what happens when you get caught outside of those rules?
Mm,
What happens when
either
you're
get in.
trying to shift perspective? What happens when you actually don't align with what is there?
There being like the rules, the
Yeah,
norms.
the norms. Let's look at those.
Lecture, get talked to, feel my parents' disappointment, to be in the discomfort of knowing I did something wrong, etc.
Where are there examples where your value has all of the sudden, because you've no longer adhered to that, your value is no longer acceptable, or where your value has diminished greatly?
Well, I can come up with examples of this, but the thing I'm struggling in a little bit is to what extent that's something created by me versus something created by my parents, by authority, by etc.
Well, and again, remember that you're co-creating this environment. And
Mm-hmm.
so when you look at the rules of work versus the rules of family, those are foundationally different. And so when we look at some of the elements of belonging and rites of passage, going back to your initial element, part of the rites of passage is learning how to grow. Historically, what we are meant to do is grow past the previous generation. That is the goal. The goal is to become better than the previous generation. And so when we conform, when we go back to being perfect, when we go back to this has to be the way that my parents or I was socialized to behave, that actually restricts growth from actually occurring, because our value of somebody who's pushing the boundary or innovating or challenging doesn't actually get to be recognized. And recognition of another human being when they look different, when they operate different, is actually one of the foundational elements that most people struggle with.
Hmm. Interesting. We're starting to come up to the top of our time. So like a couple quick questions for you. Like where would you say the current edge for this line of work that you're in? Like where is the edge? Where's the edge?
Where's the edge? So I
And
would
maybe can I provide an example first in my line of work? Just
sure.
so that,
Yeah.
yeah. So I would say the edge is in, I mentioned thresholds at the start. It's for people moving beyond the realm of the intellectual understanding of it to the actual practice of it. And that remains the edge where people understand it very well, but are not so much embodying it. What do you see for
Yes.
yours?
Well, I would see that it looks like grief. And I think most people try and avoid grief.
Mm,
And I think that the way that I have um, conceptually broken down belonging to bring people closer together
hmm
is part of a workhorse pattern that I have really leaned into my entire life. Doing hard things, building a framework, preserving, through what other people would stop at.
hmm
That's how I metabolize unresolved grief,
hmm hmm
right? And so there's this thrill of getting to the other side of something difficult.
Yeah.
And I think that the edge is really whether we're sitting in the grief not as a project,
Mm,
not as a workhorse, but as a way to grow and move through things for something better.
This is
And I
sort of
think
like
that,
the felt experience that comes as you move towards a state of more belonging. There's some grief in
sure.
the kind of like the gate through which people have to pass.
Yeah,
May
absolutely.
I ask what do you see the edges organizationally for organization? Because I would imagine organizations would hear this and they're like, well, no brainer. We got to create belonging. Let's create a belonging. No brainer. But of course, if it was that easy, we'd all be reading posts on LinkedIn, transforming, and you and I wouldn't have jobs. So what is the edge you see there?
Yeah, so I would say that the edge there is really looking at what leaders are doing to actually regulate their environments. And I would say that the edge of dysregulation is something that has existed for so long that people walking into any environment do not have to hold accountability or responsibility for their reactions.
Okay, so
And
so I'm just going to try to make this very real. So part of what I'm hearing you say is the edge is that leaders aren't standing to hold or create accountability for what's like the dysregulation that's happening. Is that right? Like
absolutely,
they can
absolutely.
understand it, but to actually stand in that, gotcha. Please continue.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, no, no, I love that you paused me there to just ground it. So, from that perspective, you have a lot of leaders who believe that they are making changes, who
Uh-huh.
believe that they are, I am belonging,
Yes.
right? But
Bless them.
actually, bless them,
Yeah.
they are just recreating patterns of dysfunction that are continuing to mask their best people being able to perform at their ceiling.
Mm,
And I think that that is one of the largest gaps and where it's very uncomfortable because it forces people in positions of power to actually have to reflect on what they need to then give up in
mm.
order for them to create a space where all of their people can actually perform.
Really well distinguished. What do you find? I mean, that's the heart and soul of it, right? Everyone wants to develop leadership. No one wants to have their leadership developed. It's ugly and messy, and it, or at least we want to, as long as that's intellectual. But when it means, the exposed embodiment. So what do you find, like, imagine there's people listening, they're like, I really want to create more of that. And I really understand that the threshold Andrea is talking about. And like, what do you find supports leaders to actually move beyond that?
Well, I'm going to use the tool that I have been
Sure.
using because I think that our language is so important. So
Mm-hmm.
first, one of the things is that we have to realize that you are consistently, doesn't matter who the person is, you are co-creating that relationship.
Mm.
And so you have to be able to look at your own. What are you giving them that you're not recognizing, or what are they actually giving you that you're also not recognizing?
Mm-hmm.
And so I use that assessment. I use the belonging breakdown assessment, which anybody can use it. It's free, belongingfirst.com/belonging breakdown.
Mm.
The language of that provides a context for conversation.
Mm-hmm.
And so the conversation where you go from that after you've taken that assessment to actually get in your own head, like, where am I actually not giving somebody clarity or predictability
Mm.
that I'm actually creating the problem for that person? And so being able to actually do some reflection before you're going into whether that's a one-on-one, whether that's doing some coaching, whether that is actually looking at how you are helping people perform at their best.
Mm-hmm.
um, I think there's a lot of leaders that just want followership but don't actually understand what it means to um, lean into empowering others to be amazing.
Well, and I would
And
imagine, just to
yeah.
jump in, that question you are inviting, leaders to sit with, where am I? And then, the rest of what you said, which I will pretend I repeated perfectly. um, that's a question that I think is easy to answer intellectually and not let it touch you one iota. And if I'm hearing you correctly, especially when you talk about, like, there's some grief that we have to confront in
Yeah.
doing that, like, are those leaders willing to sit with that question to the point that it actually creates a genuine experience of grief? Because if you're standing for other people to walk through that gate, that's what they're going to be confronting. I assume this is your work, not so much mine, but what I think is beautiful about that is it shows us the work you're talking about asks something of people. It's not just an intellectual endeavor.
Absolutely. And I think the piece that I want people to walk away from is, belonging isn't how people feel.
Mm.
Belonging is how people perform. And you can't belong harder.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Like, belonging is you and I co-creating. And so, there's this really great saying that goes, children will always rise to the ceiling of the environment. And if that
Uh-huh.
environment is unsafe, they will act out, they'll leave, they'll disengage, they'll be traumatized into silence. And that is the same thing in any relationship. And so I think when we look at relationships that fail, when we look at leadership that fails, when we look at um, roles that fail, each person had a part in that. And how we co create that is actually part of holding ourselves responsible and accountable to the feeling that we are in, but also recognizing that that feeling is also challenging my performance.
Mm-hmm.
So, where there's anger, where there's grief, where there's frustration, where there is being challenged, conflict, friction, um, that has to be something we process. And we have language to process the emotion so that we move forward.
Mm-hmm. I
Um,
can hear the passion in your voice as you're speaking about that.
mhm.
One final thing, and then I'd love to hear, where people find more of your work. We'll talk about that. But, like, so the work I do is highly geared towards the individual. How is the individual showing up? And that includes, um, you know, supporting people to distinguish what is the space that I'm stepping into. And that would include, is this a space that asks me to fit in? Or is this a space for which there is belonging? I think I'm using your language correctly.
Yeah.
But that work would be more looking at like having the leader see what is being asked regardless of a particular space and what's on offer, and then deciding for themselves, like, is this a place where I want to show up? Do I want to try to fit in? And what are the consequences of that going to be? Do I want to show up and not try to fit in? And just, can I hold that tension? Because that's going to create a tension in the space, which sometimes can resolve beautifully, other times not at all. Or do I want to seek a different space and take that on? So it's kind of interesting because I'm seeing our work is almost operating towards the same. There's a degree to which the ultimate place we're trying to get to is harmony, is the word I would use.
Yeah.
I think that might be fair. But yours
Sure.
is more in the spaces that are being created, and mine would be more at the lens of like the individual stepping into any particular space. Any thoughts on that before we go to what you're up to?
Yeah, I would say that that wouldn't be entirely true, that
Cool.
it's the individual versus the environment. I would say that belonging is actually recognizing that you're both, and the responsibility to self and the responsibility to the environment. And I think that what a lot of people try and do is they stay in one or the other. And that space is actually where the tension, the conflict, the friction lies. So the brain treats food and water as a resource. The brain also treats belonging as a resource
Sure.
metabolically.
Very, very
And
important resource too.
yeah.
Arguably more important than food. And I mean, attachment and stuff is, so they say it's the most important part of survival, right?
So when you think about that, I think it's looking at what are you bringing? What are you taking? And how are you understanding what impact you have on another and what impact they have on you? That relational component is, I would say, the heart of belonging and where we all can perform at our peak.
Yeah. What a beautiful note to end on. You know, like, what's our impact and how can we make it easier for, it's just awesome. Thanks for putting that button on it. Where do people find, I mean, I see your web, well, I don't know, is this your website, belongingfirst.com?
So belongingfirst.com is the belonging kind of science of it. And then Andrea Carter Consulting is my other website.
Yeah.
You can find me on LinkedIn. I post a lot there. So Andrea D. Carter. Otherwise, you'll go to Jay-Z's sister.
What a curse.
She's got great work too. So, you know, but yeah. And I also, of course, write on Substack. So, but you can get to all of that through my websites.
Very cool. And is there any, like, is there anything you're launching or any programs or anything like that?
Yeah, well, I have a book coming out shortly, which I'm really excited about. I don't have an actual, release date yet. I'm still working with my editors on that, but hopefully September 2026 is where we're kind of at right now. It really goes into, the 5 indicators of belonging, the 4 pathways, and then learning how to actually leverage it so that you can be in great relationships, and what that impact then has on the spaces that you occupy.
If people want to get a hold of that, what's the best way for them to kind of like be plugged in so that they get wind when it comes out?
Yeah, I would say go ahead and take the belongingfirst.com/belonging breakdown. When you put your email in there, that will allow you to actually take the test, experience some of the science for yourself, and then it puts you into, if you choose, you can select to learn more, and that will put you into a queue so that when the book is released, you have access.
So cool. One silly last question, but like, how have you found the editing process for your book?
Well, scientific editing is always challenging. I don't think that I have written anything peer-reviewed without having at least 3 revisions. That's just part of the process, right?
Of course.
And so this editing, I would say, is interesting because it's challenging me to, just like you did, and I so appreciate, Adam, how you've shown up in our podcast today. When you challenge people to clarify and clarify and clarify. What it does is it really grounds what you're doing. And I think language is something that is so important right now that I have been, as much as editing is frustrating, it's also a place, just like that question that you asked me through email correspondence. I think it's a place of great discovery.
Well
And
said.
editing is I actually think if everybody had to write their um, thoughts and processes and things down, clarity would be something that we would get to so much faster. It's messy in our minds. It's messy when it's up here.
Yes.
And so bringing it down allows us to ground and it allows us to grow.
Mm. I was I'll share this story and then I'm gonna plug the intensive once and then we're gonna wind down. But I was writing a post and I'd written the post and then I threw it at AI and I was like, I want you to look at this. Here's my goals with this piece of writing. I don't want you to just give me alternative sentences. I want you to tell me what I'm missing and tell me what I should practice doing instead.
Mhm.
It was so frustrating because the answer was right there. I knew I could go to this robot and be like, just give me the right sentence. And it would give me the right sentence. Of course, it flattens the writing because then our writing looks like everyone else's writing and blah, blah. There's a million reasons why not. But in that experience, I really relate to what you're describing. And part of the reason why we don't all write our thoughts down and then edit them, because it
Yeah.
demands, it's cognitively, it's heavy. It takes
Yeah.
something to like pull it down. So the other thing I'm present to is, that's actually a digression. So for me, people, we've got the intensive is coming up. That's May 26th through 29th. So we're 2 months out. That's an opportunity to cross the threshold I was describing. So the people in the room are people that are at the point where they're aware there's a threshold that they want to cross. They're aware that there's diminishing returns that are starting to show up, and you can feel that. And you're aware that there's something on the other side that is asking something of you, and you are up to have that change you. So you can go to, that's my turn for a long URL, evergrowthcoaching.com/the-intensive/CX3. No, there's nothing after that. It's just /the-intensive. Okay, Andrea, I have so enjoyed this conversation. I really appreciate you being game to have me interrupt and to seek clarity and to put up counterpoints or just look at this from a whole bunch of different angles. I think what you're distinguishing and speaking and supporting the creation of is super, super, super important. And I'm really grateful to have grounded, empathetic, rational voices like yours in the space, because one of the things, this is my experience, is not necessarily right, but is that topics like this are touchy because they ask us, to
Mhm.
your point, to get in touch with grief. And it never occurs to us like that's what we're doing. It occurs to us like righteousness. I'll speak for myself. It occurs to me like righteousness and like very good justifications for why I don't need to look down a particular path, and arguments
Mhm.
for why should I have to look here when they're not, and all of that. And so I really acknowledge you for holding a challenging space and being willing to look inwards and to do that work, because we need more leaders like that. So thanks for everything you brought. Thanks for the research. Thanks for writing your book. Everyone go follow her stuff. And thank you for being here.
Thank you, Adam. It's been such a delight, and I so appreciated how you've held the space. So thank you.
Cool. All right, everyone. Have an amazing Friday. It's a long weekend, so I hope you have awesome plans, and we'll catch you guys next week. Bye-bye. And then, Andrea, we're just going to stay here briefly